Hi, I'm Tim, and welcome to the 1916 Company. This is Collector Conversations. Today's interview isn't so much an encounter as it is a reunion. Wesley Smith, founder of Standard H, interviewed me on his podcast when we were shut in with COVID back in the spring of 2021. The shoe is on the other foot, the watch is on the other wrist. Wesley, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's always good to see you.
This is just a pleasure. You have an incredible collection. You come to collecting from a place of very strong aesthetic foundations, but that didn't start with watches, it started with fashion. Take me back to those first steps.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as an accessory to fashion, I think they kind of, pair well together in that sense. But I just started working retail at an early age and then trickled my way up through sort of brand pricing, if you will, going from, J. Crew to Banana Republic to Gucci eventually. And
that was starting in high school?
And yes. I worked in a surf shop. It was a bike shop, then a surf shop, which kind of got me on the apparel thing. And then J. Crew in college, Banana Republic, multi-brand boutiques after that. And then I moved to California and kept going.
So around 2007, you moved. I guess you were originally from North Carolina?
Raleigh, right.
Okay.
Yep.
So, coming from U.S. mid-Atlantic, there wasn't much of a fashion scene. You had to choose, I guess, between New York and Los Angeles. How'd you make that choice?
Surf and golf. So weather-related. I could surf and play golf year-round in L.A.
And coming from Long Island, I can confirm that you can't do much of anything year-round there, so good call. So now you're in Southern California, and I guess you'd been exposed to the fashion previously through the retailers where you'd worked. But when did you get this sense that you'd absorbed enough of the culture to start creating it in your own right? When did that first entrepreneurial spark hit?
I don't know. I think, I took an entrepreneurship class in college, so that was part of it, and you had to choose a business to launch. So I actually chose an apparel brand because I'd wanted to do it since high school. I went to a high school where there was a dress code, not a uniform, but it was coat and tie to class. And so that kind of got me on the fashion kick from that perspective and tailoring and pairing back with, suits and ties and shirts and things of that nature. So it all just was sort of the perfect storm, either, through high school into college and then, moving to LA and working further in fashion in that sense. And
so before we get too deep into that, my first really fine watch was one that I more or less received for high school graduation. We've got your high school graduation watch right here. Take me through that initial experience.
Yeah, so I was away at boarding school, and you don't do anything at boarding school on the weekends other than go to the mall and go to movies and such. So didn't have a car there and things of that nature. So I'd end up at the mall, and I remember I was trying to think of a gift for my grandmother to give me for high school graduation, because she would ask my parents, what does Wesley want? And I was like, I don't know. I just always wanted a watch. And, I wore the Timex Ironmans and things of that nature over the years and through middle school and such. And I was like, I found it's the officer's ratchet bezel is what that was called back in the 90s. I think it was 96 or 7 when I actually stumbled upon it in the mall in Asheville, North Carolina. And I just fell in love with the watch. And at the time, it was quite sizable, It wasn't a small watch. I remember I used to get comments in the elevator my freshman year in college, like, man, that's a pretty big watch you got on, which was kind of funny in 1998.
Back then it was like a Panerai. It must have seemed huge.
Yeah, totally. And then to pair back with your Panerai comment, I mean, there was military sort of inspired as well, being a Swiss Army. But I loved the watch. It was, I don't know, I think it was like $300 or something, which was a momentous amount of money to me as an 18-year-old kid. But I love it, even still to this day. And as you can see, it's really the only white dial watch I own, really.
Continuing on your journey through kind of fashion, cars, and watches in that order, how did you start to center your brand on automotive, inspiration? Because I'm not sure I immediately see the link between cars and clothes, but you managed to see that kind of intuitively. Yeah,
I think it's more a function of combining all of my passions. And it was, and I'm also, I kind of like the solicitation of a double take. So my logo looks familiar, but a lot of times it solicits a double take on the hat. And I think it's sort of the under the radar kind of moving quietly in fashion. And so I take the inspiration and say, I told you the story earlier about the blue Scuro color, which is like a darker blue.
Yes.
But it's a 1950s Ferrari color. So it's not really the if you know kind of scenario, but it kind of is in the same breath. Like if it's a color that you may or may not recognize, it's not just any blue, it's a very particular blue.
Yeah, the Ferrari blue from my youth was Tour de France blue, back in the 550 Maranello era.
It's a beautiful car.
If you come from that era or you're into that era of Ferrari, you're going to recognize that color. And especially if you're in the vintage Ferrari scene, you'd recognize this color.
Yeah, sure.
Now, standard H, stick shift.
Right.
Surprisingly, having a renaissance among young people, which is cool and wonderful.
Yes.
But it sort of became like the talisman for your brand. And I guess you were just sort of driven by your passion for cars. And fundamentally, cars are big machines, watches are little machines. Is that what ultimately drove you to get into watch collecting in earnest? So there's a lot of crossover between car guys and watch guys.
I think it came from my fashion and lifestyle blog, primarily, that I launched like in the late aughts when, the blogosphere was running rampant. At the time, I was reposting articles from Hodinkee and Ben when they were, a party of two, maybe, with Stephen Pulverant, perhaps. But yeah, it was really about having this one on my wrist, obviously, but like dreaming of other stuff and then learning about Patek and, the more expensive stuff. And then it was a walk also down Rodeo Drive when, I stumbled into IWC not knowing what the heck it was and falling in love with the Portofino chronograph.
So now you moved to the West Coast in 2007. I guess you started with Standard H at some very low level of accessories in about 2015.
Correct.
Around 2017, you started moving into expanded accessories, things you could wear, clothes, jackets, shirts. At what point did you bring watches into that sort of world, the globe of your interests? When did this Portofino happen?
Well, this happened around that time in 2016, 2017, I think. I first saw this watch in 2007, and at the time they had the square pushers, actually, on that. And then they moved to this one, I think only a couple years later. I want to say 2009 or 10. I can't remember. But this came into the fold in like 2016, 2017, I think. But yeah, I started making a watch box as a result as I got further into this. So now I do an accessory called the Defender watch box, which is a double entendre for the Defender vehicle, which is a little more robust, military-esque type of vehicle, even though it's really kind of a farm vehicle. And then a 50 caliber ammo can.
No, that's actually cool. That's a good idea. And it's funny, too, because the Defender, no one used to talk about Defenders. It was, Range Rover Series 1, 2, 3 and Defender, and it was only of interest to a few, like, weird British car quirky guys.
Yeah.
Now everyone's got a Defender here in Bala Kenwood, Philadelphia.
Yeah.
But it's a really cool idea to sort of tie the cars in, and you do have some watches that tie the cars in. Was the watch in any way a surrogate for a car back at a time when you couldn't have, like, a full garage? You could still have a full watch box?
Sure, and still is kind of to this day because I still only drive my GTI. Like I don't have a full garage full of 3 cars, a Defender and Ferrari. Like I don't have that kind of money. First of all, second of all, it's kind of yes, it's definitely space related as far as storing goes. These are obviously far more affordable, generally speaking, than cars are, and a lot less upkeep. So there is that. I think that's a through line with a lot of watch collectors who are also car guys, I would say.
Yeah, it's hard to find space for a large garage, but it's relatively easy to find space for the watches.
Right.
The thing, though, is you think you're saving money by getting into the watches, and then you realize you're really not.
Right.
So now, it seems like watches just sort of happened in your life, and you got to a point where you're making car-inspired clothing for people who love watches. When did all 3 of those come together?
It was really, as you're well aware, the podcast, right? So like I started a podcast primarily to explore the lives of entrepreneurs and anybody who's been instrumental in growing a company. Now, Standard H is the first company I've ever founded, so I thought maybe I could learn something, and then the interest of not gatekeeping, I thought I would share that information with an audience. So I started a podcast. And now it's far more like on the personal level. It's a little bit less promotional of the said guest's business per se. But yeah, it's just a great casual conversation about their lives, how they got to where they are. Well, I interviewed Adrian Barker of Bark and Jack, YouTube fame, and that episode seemingly outperformed many of the others prior. And so as a result, I was like, oh, well, my listener obviously likes watches. And as a watch fanatic at that point, as I am, I was like, this is a very easy transition to start, hosting more and more watch folks. And then you came on. And
yeah, I was podcast number 60.
Yeah, that's right. Was it 60?
It was 60.
Wow, 60.
Yeah, we got to do another one.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are you on now?
We need the update.
What number are you on?
140? I think 139 comes out next Monday.
Check it out. But, it's really cool that you saw this sort of convergence of what you were doing with the interest of your clients, and you realized, it wasn't just you into watches. It was a lot of people who were actually buying your clothing, buying your accessories, and you can only buy so many cars. And I'll be honest, even doing what I do, you can only buy so many watches.
Sure.
But you've got a lot more flexibility to accessorize with clothing, with hats, with leather goods, with watch boxes. I'm kind of curious, did you start designing these things around your own collection, or did you try to project what you thought your client wanted?
No, good question. I think it's more to do with the lifestyle of watches, and I wanted something so sort of the parameters, I didn't want just storage, I wanted to be able to transport the watches. So rather than just having a watch box you throw in another bag, say a backpack, and go either traveling or a watch meetup or, a gathering of sorts, or a road trip or whatever it is you're doing, I wanted something that felt like it had its own utility almost, and that you could literally carry your watches into your event or put it into the backseat of your car. And so that's kind of what started getting me down the rabbit hole of thinking of its design. And I'm like, all right, well, what is the type of box that also has a handle other than a briefcase, right? Because
it's got to be, I guess, more fashionable than a Pelican, but also more refined too.
Right, yeah, totally. And then it's also like what hasn't been done before that I was aware of, at least at that point. So I think I was like in a hardware store or something, and I saw like a plastic one that looked like, I think it was a 30 caliber size. And I was like, well, that's cool. But like, I also wanted to say, like, what could somebody use to go to their meetup and that wanted to take a decent sized subset of their collection without bringing 40 watches and without bringing one watch or two watches? Like, what if you wanted to bring 8 or 9, considering you might probably have one on your wrist as well?
Yeah, that's always the rule. It's fill up the watch box plus 1.
Right, exactly. So, and that's kind of how I went down, and I was like, well, what size box could hold 8? How could I configure these trays inside? All that stuff. So, yeah, that's kind of how that thing was born.
So now in terms of your collection today, you've got kind of 2 different threads. You've got some classical luxury watch brands. You've got Cartier, Tudor, IWC, Lange and Sohne. Then you have what would be, I guess, described more as micro brands in the modern parlance. These micro brands like Brew, or, for example, you've got over here Formex. You have Autodromo with the Vallelunga, and you have a very personal association. I wouldn't call Oris a micro brand. No. Well, let's talk about the micros. Let's talk about Autodromo, let's talk about Brew, and let's talk about Formex and how you got into these, because these are high style, but not necessarily high dollar.
Bingo. Yeah, I think it's, you hit the nail on the head. I think as far as Bradley goes in Autodromo, I don't think anybody does automotive-inspired watches better. And that's kind of full stop. And that's sort of how this began. And Bradley graciously came on my show as well 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, at Wind Up Watch Fair in Chicago. I believe was the 10-year anniversary of this guy. So he re-released this. I believe the movement's different from 10 years ago. And it looks like a tack,
And it hasn't aged. It looks as fresh today.
It's amazing. You and I briefly spoke about the Daytona-esque strap.
It's almost like a pleating or a ribbing of the leather, like the old Daytona seats on the 365 GTB4, and of course a very popular option today on Ferrari, because everything in a Ferrari is now optional.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But a really cool piece, and it's almost like you got a little bit of a Jaeger instrument meets the Giuliano Mazzoli Manometro. It's a very cool fusion of a lot of different threads of design, and lugless. Yeah,
I mean, and it sits really nicely on the wrist, and it pairs well with my apparel, right? So, like, it's kind of a seamless thing,
Now, I guess part of the fun of these micro brands is that you can actually know who made the watch.
Right.
With watches, like Brew, this is very personally identified with the creators. This is a watch that looks like it could have come out of the 1970s.
Sure.
It's very much contemporary, including in how the bracelet feels, which is very solid.
Yeah, and John, what more can you say about one of the nicest guys in watches? He's become a good friend. We were just in Toronto recently and walking around the city and exploring the city together and just kind of hanging out. And yeah, he was actually wearing that watch that day that we were hanging out and walking around. So yeah, I mean, I think the through line you'll start to hear as we delve deeper into the collection here is that friendships and personal relationships for me are so important and near and dear to my heart that a lot of these are sort of born and birthed out of friendships, really. And John is no exception.
So while you were out in the city, did you take in any of the architecture? I know you're a fan of architecture.
You know, we did a little bit. We saw some new builds. They were still under construction. There was this like coppery brown looking building near the water that was just insane. I've posted photos of it. Don't know who the architect is. Didn't really have time to stop and talk to the crew.
There aren't a whole lot of architectural tours of Toronto. You know, Chicago, New York, maybe old LA, but not so much Toronto. I think Toronto is where you go to shoot a budget with a non-union crew.
Right.
But a really cool piece, a mecha quartz too, and great use of color. Yeah. A watch that really has a little, I don't know, it's redolent to the 70s, but when you hold it in the hand, it doesn't feel like a bracelet out of the 70s. It feels like a luxury product. Yeah,
I totally agree. The wearability of that, and I want to say it's 37 millimeters, if I'm not mistaken.
And yet it's got more wrist presence than that because of the integrated bracelet and the color.
And that was honestly one of the inspirations of getting this piece is I'm so sort of like monochromatic, if you will, that like that was a left turn for me, and in such a like a pleasing way. It just that pop of color is it's a lot of fun, and I think that's kind of the point.
Yeah, you do sort of have like a fashion designer vibe. You've got almost like a auto mechanic meets Steve Jobs type thing. You just don't have the turtleneck.
That's hilarious.
So okay, speaking of all black, okay here. We were talking about the use of unidirectional carbon fiber on this dial and how refreshing a change that is from like the weave patterns that seemed so cool 30 years ago. Tell me how you were drawn to this watch, because this does seem more your sartorial style than anything else in the collection.
Interesting. I think it really comes down to like material science. I'm kind of on this material science kick right now within watches, and this was kind of the jump off with the carbon. I think I really, really, really love the titanium Ingenieur that was released last year. And so I'm starting to like, I mean, I've got steel coming out of my ears, so it's kind of one of these things where what are the different types of materials that I can then put on my wrist? And this thing is just crazy light, obviously. I've worn it to the gym a few times. But again, this is through another kind of fair that I've done. Not that this needs to be like the promotional.
No, by all means.
But Intersect is another watch show that I've now sold at my apparel, and so I've met the Formex guys a few times. And again, it's not only just material science, but it's also now friendship. So it's kind of one of these things where it's just the perfect intersection of relationships, material science, aesthetics, usability. All these things made that just a pretty easy trigger to pull, really.
And it's a cool distinguishment. I mean, it really is a feather in its cap that this is a chronometer.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not something you often associate with micro brands, because it's kind of, that last step that a Swiss brand would naturally take. It's not a super cheap thing to do or an easy thing to do. So yeah, I mean, being a chronometer and using so many different materials with the combination of the polish, the satin, the matte finished, and then the UD carbon of the dial, it's just a really good watch. And it highlights how you don't need colors to achieve contrast.
Sure, yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the high polished matte, to your point. Yeah, exactly. So much depth.
It's very mechanical too. I mean, you've spoken in the past about things like hiding stitching, hiding seams, kind of tucking away the fabrication. This is almost the obvious, I mean, this is almost the exact opposite. This is bringing the machine from the inside out and showing you how it's put together. Are you drawn to that at all?
Totally. Yeah, no, I mean, that's really well said, and maybe even just like a subconscious reason why I like it,
Speaking of which, now you talked about relationships, which it should be mentioned are not exclusive to micro brands. There are still larger brands that are run on a very personal basis.
Yeah.
Oris is a big one, and you've got a real story behind this Aquas right here.
Yeah.
Or pardon me, it's not an Aquas.
The Diver.
The Diver.
Yeah. I've become really close with the brand VJ, their North American CEO, and Josh Shanks, who works in marketing. Big shout out to those two. They've become very close friends of mine. And embarrassingly, I kept seeing them with no Oris on my wrist. And so I was just kind of waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right aesthetic. Again, I've got more than one watch here, so I needed something distinct, right? And this, I think, is my favorite model, but this, more importantly, at 38 millimeters is like the perfect sweet spot in the size. And I didn't want just like another black dial diver, right? And so this limited edition piece that they just came out with recently, it's got like a handwriting kind of font for the logo, which is fun, but that shade of blue is just so unique. And I'm a big fan of blue as much as I wear black. I would say navy is probably the other shade that I wear most often. So this will get a momentous amount of wrist time for sure.
And, you know, the Défenseur de l'Enfance, it's a very cool cause, and, you know, save the children in so many words. It has this really cool, almost childish sort of script and font used on the dial, multicolor, almost like something you'd see in a playpen or a bounce house.
Totally.
It's got a very sort of playful air about it. So it's a bit sober, it's a vintage style diver, but at the same time, it's a little bit irreverent.
Yeah, I love it. And honestly, and the other thing I really enjoy about it is the bezel. It's not black, it's not a dark color, it's silver.
I absolutely see that. This is a bezel with raised, relieved individual numerals and indices, and then it's got a media blast to bring everything else into contrast.
Yeah.
Really cool piece. And actually, not your only modestly sized vintage diver. So you've got two. You've got Oris, which stems from a deeply personal relationship with the brand. I would be shocked if you know Mr. Tudor quite as well.
I don't know Mr. Tudor, no. But what I can say about this watch is this was the first watch I fell in love with. But this wasn't the first watch I ever bought. The first watch I ever bought, you know, big boy watches, you know, price tags with commas, let's say. I had a 41 millimeter ETA Black Bay Black, like the original one from 2015. Over time, as you get deeper and you start being a little bit more discerning with how things wear and such, I found that watch was just too chunky, and that big crown kept rubbing in the back. I kind of like to wear my watches a little low on my wrist towards my hand. So that crown would dig into the back of my palm often. So I wasn't really wearing it. And I know they were kind of hot during COVID. It was kind of, I think they only made that watch for like 6 months or something like that.
It was a very short run.
The smiley face, you know, at the bottom there at 6. So I sold it. And though I made money on the watch, that was great, I found that I missed it. I missed that aesthetic. And it was my first one. And now I sort of like, I don't know if you noticed, but if you take that off the pillow there, you will see an engraving that I engraved this one on because I think this is the perfect wearing watch. And so this one actually says, never sell your first, as a nod to, don't do that.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting philosophy. And I guess, you know, we talked about wearing your heart on your sleeve with the watch. You really are wearing your heart on your sleeve with that little message.
Yeah.
And I have to ask, does it apply to cars too?
Well, I mean, that's since long gone. Yeah, I mean, but I actually do have somewhat of a story then. Like I was, my grandfather gifted me his Rolex. He was like my hero, right? Like he was like, I wanted to be my grandfather. Like forget Superman, I want to be my grandfather, you know? And when I graduated from high school, he had a Jeep Cherokee for 10 years. So I got an 88 Jeep Cherokee in 1998.
Oh, the XJ.
Which was his, the boxy style, 4-door, navy blue with gray plaid fabric seats. It was beautiful. It was in my grandfather's car. So it was immaculate, you know. I mean, he was already retired by that time. And and so he gifted me that. And unfortunately, I ended up selling it because it developed a bit of an oil problem. And as a result, it was like $700 every time you took it in, or $1,400 here and there. So anyway, I got rid of that. And ever since, like, I don't know, maybe COVID, I've been on the hunt on eBay, everywhere, trying to find that Jeep Cherokee.
You still got the VIN, you would recognize it if you saw it.
I think I would, yeah. Yeah.
It's amazing you tell that story because my first car was a 1999 Jeep Cherokee Sport. It was one of the XJs.
No way.
It was the 4-liter. It was the Borg-Warner Auto. It was 4-wheel drive. And yeah, it had basically 3 options. It had power windows, it had 4-wheel drive, and it had the 4-liter engine. I drove that thing to the ends of the earth, and I later sold it to my parents for like $1,000 or something. And they traded it in on a Wrangler years later. I wish I still had. I wish I bought it back.
It was so good. It was so good. I took it off road. I had BFG all-terrains on it. It was great.
It made a wonderful sound, an American straight 6. I mean, granted, those are back in the Jeep world, but it was completely singular. It had so much torque. It could idle up over a curb or a bump or a rock. It was indestructible. I crashed it. I repainted it. Heaven and earth, parked it at the seawall when I went to boot camp.
Yeah.
Great memories of that truck. So if you ever find yours, I'll let you know if I find mine.
Yeah, that'd be great. Would love to hear about it.
Now, color. Okay, so we talked about how you like to black everything out, but it wasn't that way initially. What on earth is going on here?
Okay, so my mom actually is the one who brought this one to my attention. You know, I was long into the journey, so to speak, and she's like, oh, I think it was when they were moving, actually, and that got dug out of a closet somehow in I don't know, shoebox or whatnot. Mechanical movement.
It's an automaton.
Unbelievable. My mom said, hey, I found this. I think this was your first watch. Do you want it? I was like, are you kidding me? I was like, obviously the strap's missing, right? So couldn't possibly tell you where the other end with the pin buckle is. But my mom sent me this during COVID.
You're the only person I've ever met who can say that his first watch ever was a manual wind, mechanical, Sesame Street automaton in a Lady Datejust case size. That is a one of one.
Yeah, I mean...
That is a first for me.
I'll take it.
And the amazing thing is here on the back, it says Swiss made. And then on the dial, it says copyright 1978.
Unreal. And now I wasn't 5 in 78.
No, but oh my gosh. That is genuinely awesome. On the other hand, my commiseration trying to find a properly sized strap for that guy.
Yeah.
Lug spacing 9 millimeters maybe. So speaking of color, we may as well continue on a color kick. Sub 200, very, very, very different from the rest of your collection.
Yeah.
But also, paradoxically, despite value pricing, probably your most solid feeling watch.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I love this watch. So when shooting photos for Standard H, generously, my friend Nicholas Calico dedicated some time. And when I went up to LA, Malibu area to shoot a couple years ago, he was wearing the 300 in this color. And I just completely fell head over heels for the color. But the 300 was a little large. And so also, again, relationships, friendships, James Lambden is a very good friend of mine as well from Analog Shift. He's very instrumental within the Doxa world. And so I just started to find these bits and pieces of friends who were all into Doxa. And I was like, well, I don't have one. And the 300 was a little large. So when they launched this, I believe earlier this year in the 39 millimeter size, again, I was speaking of the 38 earlier. I mean, 39 is next door, so it's perfect on my wrist. And so, yeah, this is kind of my watch community watch because I have so many people from so many different areas of my life and reasons why this brand keeps popping up, if you will, that I was just look, now there's a size that I'm super comfortable wearing. So I picked that up for that reason. And it really does represent friendship watches that overlap.
And even a little bit more, because when I think, at least in the modern era of Doxa, I think of Clive Cussler. And you got a Clive Cussler story too.
Yeah, so recently, Cameron Steiner, who was a guest on my podcast, he has Collector's Gene Radio. We recorded with him in Scottsdale, and he didn't find actually, he's become quite good friends with Clive Cussler's wife. And so he got us the ability to record at Clive's car collection, which also has its own little Clive Cussler library inside. So we recorded his episode in Clive's library, surrounded by Clive's books. And of course, Dirk Pitt, famously wore a Doxa.
And it's a really cool watch because when I look at it, I'm like, okay, it's got the vintage image, but then it's very solid. I look at the bracelet, and the removable links are fixed by screws, not, pin sleeves. The clasp, the swing arm, it's very thick gauge steel. It's got a micro adjustment built in with increments. Like, it's a very premium feeling watch.
So good.
And the bezel, I mean, that's the real deal.
Yeah.
And it's a decompression scale.
Yeah, it's amazing. I've worn it a lot since I bought it. I think I might throw it on a rubber strap in the near future so I can surf in it. I don't think that bracelet, I need to mitigate the opportunities of my board getting whacked.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is substantial enough that you got to worry about the wrecking ball effect, so I can see that definitely.
100%.
But I guess you're drawn here to the aquamarine dial. Now, when I think of these, I think, Diving Star, Sea Rambler, Shark Hunter, Caribbean, black, orange, dark blue, silver. Those are the classical Doxa Sub colors. You didn't go for one of the classical ones.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's what do I wear, what could kind of cross over between blues and blacks and grays and whites, and though all of those colors could probably be sufficient, I'm just not an orange guy, and I'm certainly not a yellow guy, even with like t-shirts and such. But then I wanted it to be bright, I wanted it to be vibrant, I wanted it to feel like summer, so it was kind of a no-brainer.
A really cool piece, and about as different as you can get from the next piece, which I really got to ask you about, because you're a car guy, but you're not like a 70s malaise era enthusiast the way I am. This Nixon feels like the inside of a Lincoln Mark V. How on earth did this happen? High
school, snowboarding, skateboarding, wakeboarding, the board sports were all like, that was what I was into, and in Raleigh, North Carolina, you could watch the X Games and feel close to the action in that sense. And the other way you felt close to the action was branding by people like Nixon. And Nixon was doing action sports watches. I, for whatever reason, am obsessed with walnut. And this may or may not be the culprit of that. But it's certainly a watch I had, I think at the end of high school, or I don't even remember what year I bought this. I may have been in college, actually, when this came out. But I feel like it was so different. And again, as a men's accessory, watches, if you want to bring something like attention away from your face, you wear a sparkly, crazy looking watch, and this one was pretty nuts at the time.
Yeah, it's almost like you combined like a Bill Blass Lincoln Mark V with a Seiko Discus Burger. It's a very eccentric watch, but I will say this, for someone who claims to have come to watches later in life, it seems between Cookie Monster, this Nixon, and the Swiss Army, that you had a pretty early attachment, at least to the idea of wearing something on your wrist.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, that's for sure. I had swatches too, like with the hot pink case protector, the little clamp on.
Oh yeah.
Mine was hot pink, I recall, but it was 1991, so that was appropriate, very, very of the era.
Yeah, no, I totally remember that. Coming out of the 80s, it was all about hot colors.
Totally.
Neon green, hot pink.
Andre Agassi.
Exactly.
Like, yeah.
Like coming off on the downslope of like the Vanilla Ice trend.
Sure.
So now Cartier, about as traditional as it gets, and really one of only two clear-cut dress watches I see on the table.
Yeah.
Tank, very traditional. How did it happen?
Wanted a dress watch. Also wanted something which I didn't even disclose to my wife when I bought it, but like...
A lot of guys say that, but also famous last words.
Well, I knew that at one point, hopefully I would become a father. And I wanted to search for a watch that would be suitable for either, boy or girl. And so that's sort of how that came up. Now, the Reverso came up as well, your JLC guy. Just found that to be a little too thick. And I love Cartier, I love the Guilloche dial. Rose gold was also new, right? Like I didn't have anything that looked like it, be it shape or material. The cabochon is it's just so cool to wind that thing. It's a beautiful watch. I've worn it on a black strap, this one as well.
Now, what do you wear with this? Because, look, I'm all about wearing dress watches and t-shirts, so I have no dogmas. Yeah. But when you think of a watch like this, do you think of a specific outfit, something you've designed or something you've admired?
Jeans and a t-shirt with these loafers, that more often than not is the outfit. It's jeans with a white t-shirt. But then I'll throw it again on a black strap. I wore it to a wedding in London last year.
No, I love it. I love it. Honestly, I've always been of the opinion that the man makes the watch, not the other way around. Right. So if you can pull it off, you can put it on. And
same with clothes.
Yeah, I'll say this. I am a big proponent of wearing American auto-branded t-shirts with jackets and Ferragamos. So I'm all about breaking the rules too. So let me ask you, do you ever pair your watches with cars? Like, clearly you have no dogmas about clothes, but do you ever get in the mindset to drive a certain car with a certain watch?
Yeah, you know, like I've always thought that I could picture myself wearing something like this, driving a Defender or something, or, you know, maybe this watch with a 911 one day. And then, of course, I like to think that, you know, the timelessness of a lot of these things, like even though this looks like it could be from the 70s, I don't know. I mean, I guess you could sort of argue it could be from the 90s as well, and then certainly of today. So, I mean, I sort of fancy myself a classic sort of timeless aesthetic, generally speaking. And I think for that reason, it's for no other reason than versatility, right? Like you can just sort of pair it back with anything, be it clothes or cars or what have you.
So now the all black look, right. The capstone here is clearly your natural match for the 911. We'll get there, but I think it's important to talk about the 2021 limited edition. This is the 3705 Tribute. This is a very core model to the heart and soul of IWC. Were you a fan of the original, or did this just strike you as a bolt out of the blue when it came out?
Well, what's funny is I remember watching like the Talking Watches episode. They had the original 39 millimeter, kind of hockey puck, sort of curvaceous sides to the case, which is not hockey puck-like, but it is thick and small like a hockey puck. But for this guy, what happened was and this predates even this, clearly, because this was 3 years ago.
This was your first blackout watch.
I was looking for all black. At the time, my friend Giorgio, who worked for a multi-brand boutique, who was an AD for IWC, he'd kind of come and gone out of the business. So when I approached him about an all-black watch, I was like, surely IWC is the way to go. I mean, granted, this is all black, I understand. But I wanted something a little bit more casual looking. And so Giorgio, newly returned to the business, said, you know, I'm not really sure, I can't think of anything right now. So he got the catalog out, and we flipped through the catalog, and it was like more or less on the last page of the catalog. And so it said like, I don't know, contact for pricing information or something along those lines. Because it was a limited edition, I don't think it had a lot of the purchasing price and some of the details for a normal catalog item. So anyway, went to the website, saw it said contact us for purchasing information or what have you. Called them up. They had one left, apparently. According to the customer service agent, either they were creating demand,
at face value.
Or yeah, exactly. So they said this is the last one we have, because at this point, I think the watch was, I don't know, I think it released between September and October that year-ish, and this was January. And so I was kind of late in the game to buy it. And I think what had happened was either somebody returned it or they canceled their order somehow. And so it sort of slipped through the cracks, and I was able to get it through the telephone, actually. I love it. I think design-wise, it's the epitome of IWC, right? Pilot's watch 1, chronograph 2nd. You get the squared-off hour hand. That's a throwback to the original. Speaking of material science, you know, you've got the Ceratanium here. The original had a ceramic case. And it's just perfect. It's 41 millimeters. It's strap monster, much in the same way as Speedmaster is.
Yeah, I like the way you accessorize that. It's really a very, I guess, tactical look to have the khaki and the NATO on the black Ceratanium case. Is this another watch you kind of associate with something like a Defender?
Yep.
Like a big, rugged, open-air SUV, 4x4 off-road vehicle?
Yep.
Really cool piece on a lot of levels. It's funny, because when you said you ordered this by phone,
yeah.
When the original came out in 1994, that was pretty much the extent of e-commerce. So it was a throwback buying experience, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's funny you should say that. I never thought about it that way.
So a really cool watch, and I guess we go from German Swiss to full-blooded German right here.
Yeah.
Now we're in state of Saxony, we're in Glashütte.
Yeah.
For many years, you've spoken of your love for Lange und Sohne. How did the dream finally come true?
Consolidation is the best word to describe that event. It was a fire sale of sorts. I was in Paris with my wife during the same London wedding that I wore this on the black strap. And yeah, walked in there. As you know, I'm a huge fan. My wife had never heard of the brand before, and she was like, that is a beautiful watch. And I was like, oh, wow. So there's like a kind of a side kind of, voice of approval in a way, right? So I was like...
You got your permission.
Though I can't afford it today, that moment in Paris, I was like, I think if I start a consolidation period, I think I can make this happen. So I sold a bunch of watches, frankly, to raise money for this and raise a little money for my company. So I was helping myself in multitudes of ways, and sold off a bunch of watches and finally pulled the trigger on what is certainly categorized as a Grail, for sure.
Oh, without a doubt, and it's a magnificent watch. I got to imagine there's at least some heartache when you have to part with something. Do you have a philosophy about watches out, watches in? When does a watch get voted off the island?
I think it really comes down to, for example, I had a couple of watches that were, black dial chronographs or variations of this. I think at one point I had 3 41 millimeter chronographs from IWC, which, speaking of relationships, Christian Knoop's become a friend as well. I feel very close to IWC. Huge IWC fan. Still have the first that I fell in love with, things of that nature. But so when it comes time to moving it, it was really just a function of, okay, if I wanted to wear that watch, I could just wear this. I don't need both. And so I start doing the mental gymnastics of how to make room. And then again, it's like, do I miss that? Or would I rather wear this? And every time I look at this watch, I don't even think about the others, right? So it's like, when you get to hopefully Grail status in collecting, which I still genuinely only consider myself to be an enthusiast and not really a collector. There's no particular ethos behind my approach per se, unless maybe versatility could maybe be the word. But this is another watch that is versatile. I wear it jeans and a t-shirt. I wore it all around the town yesterday.
Really
wearing
cool
sneakers
piece.
And shorts.
And you know what? When it came out in 1994, a 38.5 millimeter Lange, that was a big watch for a dress watch. That was a big piece.
Yeah, totally.
So it's got a lot of presence. It's got a lot of personality, and it's sort of like the Grail in hand. So where do you go from here? Have you considered maybe moving from the ranks of watch, enthusiasts to watch designer?
I don't know. That's a really solid question. I really don't know. I have sort of, much in the same way that Standard H is always items that I either want or used to own and can't buy anymore, so I sort of update them in my own personal way for the assortment for Standard H. I do have a watch idea that, funny enough, I was talking to Christian Knoop about would love to see this from IWC, and it's more or less what I would design today, I think, if I were to design a watch. And I toured the factory back in April and had lunch with Christian and shared this with him, that a lot of it is very, very, very close to something they produced in the late 30s in the Portuguese realm. And he simply looked at me and said, well, Wesley, thank you for your input, but we'd really like to focus on moving forward and not moving backwards.
Yeah, right. How many anniversary editions have they come out with? Any Swiss watch brand saying, we don't want to look to the past. Right. All they do is look to the past. So this is the state of the collection today. Mm-hmm. If people want to follow your exploits, your future style paths, decisions, and designs, where do they go? If they want to enjoy the entire universe of Standard H, where do they start?
Yes, certainly the website, standard-h.com. My handle on IG is standardh_. And then, Standard H podcast, if you're interested in listening to some shows that may or may not feature Mr. Tim Masso. And that's really kind of the best ways to follow along. Email list, that sort of thing.
Well, Wesley, thank you so much for coming out here.
Tim, thanks so much. It's a pleasure, really, truly, to be here. I really appreciate your time.
Fantastic watches, and we'll always have number 60.